Hello, everybody, and welcome to week 6. So, this is the second to last week, and this week we'll be talking about reality theory, sometimes also known as choice theory. And when we talk about reality uh, theory, we talk about William Glasser. And Dr. Glasser, just to give you a little bit of background, 1925 to 2013 was his lifespan. Um, he was a student at Case Western in Ohio, so the Midwest. Originally an engineering major. He was part of the U.S. Army during the 1940s. So after he returned from the war, he became interested in the field of psychology. So he ended up getting a master's in clinical psychology and then going to Case Western for his MD in psychiatry. An interesting thing about um, Dr. Glasser was that his residency was at UCLA, where he later taught and lived. And during his residency, he was working at the VA hospital. And he was actually kicked out of the VA hospital because he wasn't following kind of the standard of the Freudian psychoanalytic therapy. So um, after he was, I guess, just kicked out, he went to work at a school for what they called delinquent girls at the time. So, kind of the alternative school setting is a more modern term. And that's when he refined the reality theory or choice therapy. So, reality therapy really has a backbone in the schools due to Dr. Glasser's work with the Ventura School. And that's why, for my school counselors, reality therapy is really popular as a behavior intervention. LSSPs, LPs, licensed psychologists, school counselors, you name it. That's kind of um, a lot of times the theory of choice due to the theoretical background with Dr. Glasser and how he was able to refine a lot of the theories and even a lot of the educational books, the interventions I can think of, um, the life of a child and school failure, schools without failure, that was a bestseller. Um, Also, Dr. Glasser coined the term positive addiction, which even today, things like, exercise, taking care of your body, nutrition, all that's considered a positive, um, addiction. And another book that is really popular, especially with um, the teachers is the quality of school teachers. So you might have read it in undergrad education programs. A lot of education programs follow a lot of the concepts that Dr. Glasser brought. And it doesn't just pertain to schools. So institutions, the justice system, a lot of that use a lot of what Dr. Glasser emphasized. So that's just a little bit of background about choice theory and Dr. Glasser. One thing I want to point out was that just like his theory insinuates, the emphasis is on personal choice, personal responsibility, personal transformation. So here we are, the counselor therapist, we are empowering the client and we're emphasizing a choice. And going back to school, they going back to the teaching pedagogy, they teach teachers, okay, to give choices. So part of a lot of the elementary, middle, high school curriculum is choice based. So you can choose to do A or you can choose to do B, but each choice is going to have a consequence. So when we look at Dr. Landreth here from UNT in Denton, that was, I would say that he was kind of a derivative of Dr. Glasser, because if you study play therapy and you study a lot of the what Dr. Landreth talked about, you really see how his books and parental styles was always going back to giving kids choices. So, and this is just my opinion. In my opinion, play therapy is really just another form of reality therapy. It's kind of like applying reality therapy to young age, the nonverbal. So, Dr. Glasser, very influential. And we've studied um, theories that came from Europe. Dr. Glasser was 100% American, so this theory really developed. He started developing in the Midwest, and then he refined it in California. So this is kind of one of the I call it kind of the first theories that are wide range and worldwide. I mean, you talk about Latin America, a lot of the schools down there, Mexico specifically, a lot of them are based on choice theory. So, very influential, huge public figure. And he really went away from that traditional approach, psychoanalytic, you're ill, the label. He didn't believe in that. Well, it was kind of a reaction. He thought that labels were um, kind of very deterministic. So, you have depression, you're ill, that means you're always going to have depression. He he said, you don't need medication. What you need is an intervention. You need a treatment, you need a plan, you need to do something different than what you're currently doing, because what you're currently doing isn't working. So, going back to choice theory, going back to um, kind of that reaction from the prescribing medication and being deterministic. He really was an advocate, and really more than a founding father of a theory. He really, I think, revolutionized fields like education. Um, it wasn't that long ago when students would be shamed for not learning, where they would put um, donkey ears on them. Um, he kind of revolutionized that field. So, um, if I can emphasize something, I will say that he emphasized that everybody has a choice, and based on these choices, then that's empowering the client. That's making them see that it's their responsibility. So, and a lot of that goes back, in my opinion, goes back to kind of the American ideal, because as opposed to maybe a collectivist culture, where the family and the family needs are more of a priority than my individual needs. I in the Americas, we value that individuality. The bottom to riches, all that idea. So this really kind of tied in with a lot of that. So choice theory, that's kind of the view that humans are internally motivated, and they behave to control the world around them according to the same purpose within them. So, again, self determining, creating your own destiny, having that choice of, okay, if I want to get to point B and I'm at point A, what do I need to do? And it is my responsibility to do it. And how can I get there? Choice theory talks a lot about commitment, and that's kind of sticking to a plan and realizing that what you're currently doing isn't working, and there needs to be a change. So, um, going back to other theories, choice theory, in my opinion, is great because you're putting the change on the client. Um, Many beginning counselors, and this is common, I went through this process. Many beginning counselors, we're working too hard to create a change, and even beginning teachers, they're trying new strategies. They're doing this, they're doing that, they're doing all this, and they end up almost burning themselves out. Whereas choice theory, we're really putting that on the client. We're telling the client, okay, this isn't working. These are the symptoms that you're experiencing. This is kind of what's going on. Okay, how do you want to continue on this path? Is this something that you want to continue, or is this something that maybe you might consider changing? And going back to the stages of change, pre um, pre ideal the predetermination, determination, contemplation, and then the change. That's kind of deals with that, but just kind of in a different wording. So the idea is the same, concept's the same. They're just using different terminology. Choice theory talks about the cycle of counseling. Be sure you're familiar with that, and that just means um, we choice theorist first creates those core conditions that Dr. Rogers talks about. Then once we get through building a good relationship, then we can begin to move into the working stage. So, if you think about a bell curve, that's kind of what the cycle of counseling should look like. We at the beginning we're building relationship. It's all surface level. The working stage, we get into more deeper stuff. We get into homework. We get into um, those choices and putting things on the client. And then the kind of the conclusion is we talk about, okay, what's working, what's not working. If you get hiccups in the future, how can we overcome those? So, cycle of counseling is really important, and I'm sure you'll talk more about that in internship and your practicum classes. So, just be aware of that. Be aware that choice theory does preach the core conditions: unconditional positive regard, empathy, and congruence. So that's part of the involvement, and that's part of that the cycle that I just mentioned. Painting behaviors, Dr. Glasser mentioned. Um, Painting behaviors is kind of like a pre-term to what we now know as somatoform. So when somebody says, "Oh, my head hurts," I can't breathe, all that, that's just the symptoms. So Dr. Glasser was a big advocate in not just looking at the symptoms, but looking at the root cause. It's interesting because I was actually reading a study um, about kind of the differences in pain medication within the U.S. and Russia. Russia probably consumes, I think I read, maybe 5% of the pain medication that the US consumes. And a lot of what the article was mentioning is that in Russia, a lot of their emphasis is going to the root cause. Whereas in America, a lot of the emphasis is in treating the symptoms. So you can treat the symptoms, but if you don't address the root cause, you'll continue with painting behaviors. So that's something to keep in mind. Also, similar to some of the CBT that we mentioned earlier, um, Dr. Glasser talked about the perceived world, and that's kind of the reality of the client. So we all have a reality. The client brings in their own reality, and then part of a choice reality therapist is to create a more realistic picture for them. And he also mentioned something called the picture album, and that's just images that the client perceives and sees, and we try to modify that album in order to be more congruent with reality. Similar to Maslow, Dr. Glasser mentioned psychological needs, and he mentioned things like belonging, which is similar to Adler, um, the need for power, the need for freedom, the need for fun. So these are all drivers that humans need, and that kind of explains behavior. Dr. Glasser also mentioned what he called the equality world, and that's kind of like the congruence between the ideal and the reality. So if there's a big disconnect, then part of the intervention, part of the cycle is to create more of a balance for the client so that the client can be more congruent to kind of his or her own change. And um, a lot of the responsibility is on the client. Dr. Glasser always emphasized that. He said, part of therapy is being responsible, taking responsibilities, and that includes the consequence. If you're given a choice and you choose a certain choice, well, that choice has consequences. So, being able um, to take responsibility for those choices, which you see a lot in the schools. Part of an intervention is to have a student realize that those choices are affecting them and that there will be certain consequences, whether it's a natural consequence or some other form of consequence. But things like, okay, if I'm not doing my homework, if I'm not doing my um, classwork, okay, what are going to be the consequences, and does that match with my perceived world? Dr. Glasser mentioned SAMX 3, which is just an acronym. It means simple, attainable, measurable, immediate, involved, controlled by, planner, committed, and continuously done. So in the schools, you might hear SMART goals. So very similar. I think SMART goals were kind of a derivative of that SAMIC 3. So as a therapist, I would use that um, SAMIC 3 or SMART goals to work with the client to see what they want to work with and write it out have the client write it out, have the client work on it. And that would be part of their homework every week, is how can we get to those goals so that by the 6 to 8 session, the client feels like they've made progress. And there's a lot of overlap, I think, between CBT and reality therapy. Reality therapy is kind of a postmodern therapy, so it's very scientific based, used a lot of kind of self-reflection data to support change. So that's why it's real popular with institutions. Self-evaluations. So not only getting feedback like we talked about the BDI, back depression inventory, but doing things like having a journal and have the clients process some of their goals, some of their change, so that when you're reaching, let's say, the eighth session, the client can go back and can see, okay, this is where I was at the beginning of the session, I'm at the eighth session, and look how much progress I've made. So really, you want the client empowered. You don't want to be doing all the work. You don't want to be writing these goals for the client. You want the client to kind of be self-reliant so that they don't need to come to therapy. So again, your job is to empower, to motivate, to create those core conditions, to create that congruence. And one thing that I really like about choice theory is that it looks similar to the Gestalt. It looks at the total behaviors. So thinking, feeling, physiology. We look at the nonverbals, we look at the feelings. Very similar to Gestalt. The book finally mentions the WDEP system, and that is also an acronym, and it helps the client identify their wants. So determining their direction, behaviors is taking them, making self-evaluations, and designing a plan for change. So similar to the SMART goals, the WDEP system is a way for the client to reflect and to see, is it helping, is it not helping, what can I do better, what's going well for me, and how can I change what's not. So um, if I had to give you a gist, um, reality therapy, it was kind of a reaction to that traditional deterministic labels, um, and it was developed in a school setting with high-risk youth. Dr. Glasser really highlighted that personal responsibility, personal choice, and personal transformation, which I think is really empowering. So, Dr. Glasser, I would highly encourage you, that, again, beyond the scope of this course, but for my school counselors, for community counselors that want to work with agencies, a lot of good books out there related to reality therapy. Okay, well that's it for reality therapy.